The dust-choked air hung heavy over the forward operating base, a familiar taste of grit and diesel fumes that Lieutenant Commander Jason "Wedge" Thompson had long ago stopped noticing. What he noticed now was the knot tightening in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his first deployment over a decade ago. The intelligence was solid, or as solid as anything in this godforsaken corner of the Hindu Kush could be. A high-value Taliban commander named Ghani Bardar, a man with American blood on his hands and a network of insurgents loyal to him, had been pinpointed in a remote mountain village. But it wasn't the target that had Wedge worried. It was the mission itself. The plan, cobbled together by the agency and handed down to his SEAL team, and was a complex piece of joint operation choreography that felt more like a recipe for disaster than a path to success. Bardar was holed up in a village situated in a natural bowl, surrounded by high ground that offered clear fields of fire. A direct assault by his SEALs would be like throwing them into a meat grinder. The only viable option was to insert a sniper onto a specific peak, call sign Raven's Roost, to provide overwatch and take out Bardar the moment he exposed himself. The catch? That peak was a 3-mile trek through treacherous enemy-held terrain, and the sniper assigned to the shot wasn't a SEAL. It was a Marine. Staff Sergeant Gracie Medicine Crow was, on paper, the most accomplished sniper in the United States Marine Corps. A legend in the making who had been pulled from a dozen different theaters to handle the most impossible shots. But to Wedge and his men, she was an outsider. The friction began the moment the liaison from the command arrived at the briefing tent. The SEALs, the Navy's ultimate clandestine operators, were being told they would serve as a support element for a Marine sniper. They would get her to the firing point, protect her while she took her shot, and then exfiltrate her. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and the resentment was a palpable force in the room as Wedge unrolled the topographical map. Gracie stood apart from the knot of SEALs, her frame smaller than theirs, her face an unreadable mask of concentration. She was used to this, the suspicion, the dismissal. She could feel the weight of their stares, and a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She was the other, a woman in their sacred brotherhood, and worse, she was being given the marquee role in their mission. When she spoke up to question a minor detail about the insertion route, one of the SEALs, a burly operator named Mike Ox Hansen, scoffed audibly. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "We'll get you to your little hill. Just try to keep up." Gracie didn't flinch. She simply looked at Ox, her dark eyes holding a depth of focus that was more unsettling than any shouted insult. She had qualified expert with every weapon in the Marine Corps arsenal. She had held the hand of a dying spotter in a dusty Ramadi street. She hadn't come this far to be intimidated by a man with a big mouth and a bigger ego. Now the next 48 hours were a masterclass in tension. As the SEAL team prepped their gear, checking night vision devices, zeroing rifles, packing enough C4 to level a small building, Gracie remained a ghost on the periphery. She spent her time studying satellite imagery, memorizing every wrinkle of the terrain, every shadow that would fall across Raven's Roost at the precise moment of the scheduled shot. She ran wind calculations based on historical weather data, her mind a constant hum of ballistic mathematics. Wedge watched her from the doorway of the makeshift armory. He saw a professional, but he also saw a potential liability. A sniper wasn't just a shooter. They were a part of a team. And this woman wasn't part of his team. He worried about the inevitable moment when the egos in his squad would clash with her singular focus, on a distraction that could get them all killed. His gut, the same gut that had saved his platoon from an IED ambush years ago, was screaming at him that this mission was going sideways before it even began. The night before the op, Wedge gathered his men for a final briefing. The air in the tent was thick with the smell of sweat, gun oil, and unspoken dissent. He laid out the route, the comms frequencies, the emergency rally points. He stressed that their primary objective was to deliver the package. A nod toward Gracie, who stood silently in the corner, to the target destination. Ox snorted again, crossing his massive arms. "Sir, with all due respect, if it comes down to it, I can make that shot. We don't need a babysitter." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the men. Wedge held up a hand for silence. But before he could speak, Gracie's voice cut through the tension. It was calm, low, and absolute. "With all due respect to you and your team, Lieutenant Commander, this isn't about who can pull a trigger. It's about making a shot you can't even see from the ground. I'm not here to take anything from your team. I'm here to make sure you all go home when this is over." She looked directly at Ox. "Including you." The tent fell silent. For the first time, Wedge saw not just a specialist, but a fellow operator standing in front of him. The resentment didn't vanish, but it was tempered by a grudging respect. The mission was a go at 0400, and Wedge couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The Black Hawk helicopter sliced through the moonless sky, and its rotors a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of the 12 men and 1 woman strapped inside. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dim glow of instrument panels and the occasional flash of a night vision goggle check. To Gracie Medicine Crow, the world outside was a tapestry of eerie green, the jagged peaks of the mountains rising like the teeth of some great beast. She sat wedged between her own gear and the bulk of Ox Hansen, the Big Seal's earlier bravado now replaced by the focused silence of a man about to go to work. The tension in the helicopter was a different breed from the briefing room. This was pre-combat tension, sharp, electric, and unifying. Whatever their personal feelings, they were all on the same bird, heading into the same hornet's nest. The insertion was hot. They weren't on the ground for 30 seconds before the first cracks of AK-47 fire split the night. The landing zone, a flat stretch of shale that was supposed to be a cold LZ, was being probed by a roving patrol of Bardhar's men. Wedge's voice was a low growl in everyone's earpiece. "Contact front! Move, move, move! Get off the X!" The SEALs flowed off the helicopter like water, returning fire with suppressed M4s, the pops sounding more like paintball guns than instruments of death. Gracie moved with them, her M40A5 sniper rifle clutched to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't a door kicker, she was a precision instrument. But in these first chaotic seconds, she was just another target. The firefight was brief, but vicious. The SEALs, with their superior training and firepower, quickly suppressed the enemy patrol, leaving several bodies crumpled on the cold ground. But the damage was done. The element of surprise, their single greatest advantage, was gone. As the team melted into the shadows and began their arduous trek toward the peak, Wedge knew that every insurgent within 50 miles had just been alerted. "Command, this is Sabre 6. LZ was compromised. We are Oscar Mike, but expect heavy resistance. Over." The radio crackled with a terse acknowledgement. There would be no extraction until the mission was complete. They were on their own. The climb was a nightmare. The terrain was brutal, a jumble of loose rock and icy crevasses that threatened to twist an ankle or send a man tumbling into a ravine with every step. They moved in a diamond formation, with Gracie and her 2 spotters, Marines she had handpicked, at the center. The SEALs provided the outer shell, their eyes scanning the darkness for threats. The altitude stole their breath, the thin air burning in their lungs. They took turns hacking at the frozen ground with their boots, finding purchase where there was none. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the relentless climb and the whispered updates over the comms. They passed the shattered wreckage of an old Soviet helicopter, a grim monument to another war, another failed occupation. Ox moved past Gracie at one point, his face streaked with sweat and camo paint. He didn't say anything, but he gave her a curt nod. It wasn't friendship, but it was acceptance. They were in the shit together now. Just before dawn, with the first hints of gray lightening the eastern sky, they reached a saddle just below Raven's Roost. This was the most dangerous part. The final approach was exposed, a bare rock face that offered no cover. Gracie and her spotters would have to make the final push alone, while the SEALs set up a defensive perimeter to hold off any attackers. Wedge pulled Gracie aside, his voice a low rumble. "We'll hold here as long as we can, Crow, but if they come at us hard, I might have to pull the team back. You understand?" Gracie met his gaze. "I'll be fast, Commander. Just buy me 30 minutes. He clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. "Go. Be dangerous." Gracie and her spotters, Gonzalez and Patel, moved like wraiths up the rock face. They found their hide, a natural depression in the rock that offered a perfect vantage point of the village below. As the sun crested the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and amber, Gracie settled in behind her rifle. She chambered around, the metallic click a sound of finality. The village was waking up. She could see figures moving, goats being herded, the faint haze of cooking fires. And there in the courtyard of the largest compound, surrounded by a half-dozen armed guards, was Ghani Bardar. He was holding court, gesturing wildly, completely unaware that the crosshairs of a Marine sniper were centered on his chest. It was the perfect shot, but as Gracie's finger caressed the trigger, the world exploded. The ambush was perfectly timed. As Gracie settled into her firing position, the morning calm was shattered by the distinctive crump of rocket-propelled grenades and the hammering of heavy machine guns. And from 3 different directions, waves of insurgents surged toward the SEALs' defensive position. It was a coordinated assault, designed to overrun them and protect the Taliban commander. Wedge's voice screamed in Gracie's earpiece, a jumble of fire commands and situation reports that painted a dire picture. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and taking heavy fire. The SEALs were fighting for their lives, and they were losing. Gracie froze, her eyes still on the scope. Below her, Bardar and his guards were scattering, disappearing into the warren of mud-brick buildings. The shot was gone. For a split second, the weight of the world crashed down on her. She had failed. Her spotters looked at her, their faces pale. "Gracie, what do we do?" Gonzalez whispered. The mission parameters were clear. Protect the sniper, take the shot. But the men who had sneered at her, who had resented her presence, were now fighting and dying to give her those 30 minutes she had asked for. She could hear the desperation in Wedge's voice as he called for reinforcements that weren't coming. She thought of Ox, his big body probably riddled with bullets. She thought of Wedge, the commander who had trusted her with his team's safety. In that moment, Gracie Medicine Crow made a decision that defied every regulation and every chain of command. She wasn't just a precision instrument anymore. She was a Marine, and her brothers were in trouble. She shouldered her rifle and began to move. "Patel, stay on the scope. Call out targets. Gonzalez on me. We're going to the sound of the guns." It was a suicide run, a sniper leaving her perch to fight as a common rifleman. But as she scrambled down the rock face, her M40A5 slung across her back and her M4 in her hands, Gracie knew that some things were more important than the mission. The real battle was just beginning, and she was going to make sure she was in it, right alongside the men who had finally accepted her as one of their own. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of violence. Smoke and dust choked the air, mingling with the sharp, coppery smell of blood. Wedge was behind a large boulder, his M4 empty, fumbling for a fresh magazine as rounds snapped and whined off the rock inches from his head. To his left, two of his men were down, one motionless, the other screaming for a corpsman. The insurgents were swarming, using the terrain with the familiarity of men who had fought on it their whole lives. They were trying to flank the position, asked to get above them and pour fire down into the SEALs' exposed fighting hole. Wedge's heart sank. This was it. They were going to be overrun. He keyed his mic one last time, his voice grim. "Saber Actual to any station. We are being overrun. Need immediate support. We are—" His transmission was cut short by a burst of automatic fire that chewed up the ground right in front of him. Then, everything changed. A single, sharp crack echoed from the high ground to their rear, the distinct report of a Marine sniper rifle. One of the insurgents leading the flanking maneuver crumpled, his body tumbling lifeless down the slope. Another crack, and a machine gunner went silent, his finger frozen on the trigger. Crack, crack, crack. The shots were methodical, deliberate, and impossibly accurate. With each report, another insurgent fell, and the flanking attack stalled, then shattered, the surviving fighters diving for cover, confused and terrified by this sudden, invisible death raining down on them from behind their own lines. Wedge risked a glance back up the slope. There, silhouetted against the gray sky, was Gracie. She wasn't in her hide. She was standing in the open, exposed to every enemy eye, her M40A5 braced against a rock. She was firing not as a sniper, but as a guardian angel. She had given up her concealment, her safety, everything, to save them. Beside her, Gonzalez was feeding her targets, his voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos below. 200 moving right behind the rock. Crack. The insurgent behind the rock pitched forward. 300 machine gun nest left side. Crack. The machine gun fell silent, but Gracie was a whirlwind of precision death, buying them precious seconds, minutes, a lifetime. The SEALs, reinvigorated by the sudden reversal, redoubled their efforts. Wedge, his magazine finally seated, popped up and put a burst into an insurgent who had broken cover. Ox, who had been grazed by a bullet across his arm, was back in the fight, his face a mask of fury and gratitude. The coordinated assault fell apart, the insurgents breaking and running, dragging their wounded with them. The immediate threat was over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the sharp, ragged breaths of the living. Wedge slumped against the boulder, his body trembling with adrenaline. He looked up the slope, toward the figure who was now slowly, carefully, making her way down to them. The Gracie Medicine Crow reached the base of the rock, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes still carrying that unsettling depth of focus. She looked at the two downed SEALs, at the blood, at the carnage. She didn't say a word. Ox walked up to her, his arm bleeding through a makeshift bandage. He looked at her, this small woman who had just saved his life and the lives of his entire team. He extended his good hand. "Crow," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong. You're all right." Gracie took his hand, her grip firm. "We're not done yet," she said quietly. "The mission isn't over." The respite was agonizingly brief. The insurgents had retreated, but they hadn't disappeared. They were regrouping, and the SEALs could hear the distinctive sound of more engines, more men, approaching from the valley below. Bardar was calling in reinforcements. The team was battered, low on ammunition, and had two critically wounded men who needed urgent medical evacuation. They were trapped on a mountainside, and the next wave would be bigger, angrier, and determined to finish the job. Wedge gathered his team leaders and Gracie in a small huddle. "We can't stay here. We can't move the wounded fast enough to outrun them. And we sure as hell can't fight off a battalion." The options were bleak. Surrender wasn't one of them. A last stand felt inevitable. But Gracie, who had been staring at the village below, spoke up. Her voice was low, but it cut through the despair. "What if we don't have to fight them all?" She pointed toward the village. "Bardar is still down there. He thinks he's safe. He thinks we're done. If I can get back to Raven's Roost, I can take the shot. It's the only thing that will break the attack. These men are loyal to him, not to a cause. If he dies, they'll scatter." Wedge shook his head. "It's suicide, Crow. They'll see you moving. And we can't give you covering fire. We're almost out of ammo." Gracie's jaw tightened. "I don't need covering fire. I just need you to stay alive for another hour. Draw their attention. Make them look the other way." She looked at the wounded men. "For them." The huddle fell silent. It was a desperate, crazy plan, but it was the only plan they had. Ox stood up. "Then let's give her a show." The next hour was a masterful piece of deception. Wedge spread his remaining effective fighters thin, having them pop up in different positions, firing single shots to simulate a larger force. Then they used smoke grenades to obscure their movements and shouted fake fire commands to confuse the enemy. Meanwhile, Gracie began her solitary climb. It was a nightmare of exertion and terror. She moved on her belly for hundreds of yards, inching her way up the exposed rock face, her sniper rifle clutched to her side. Below her, she could hear the growing roar of the insurgent force, the chatter of their radios, the shouts of their commanders. They were massing for the final assault. Any second, a pair of eyes could look up and see her, a lone figure crawling across the gray stone. But no one did. They were all focused on the SEALs, the trapped Americans who were daring them to come closer. Gracie reached the crest of Raven's Roost, the very same hide she had abandoned hours earlier. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and her hands were shaking from the physical toll. She forced herself to breathe, to slow her heart rate. She settled into the familiar embrace of her rifle, her eye finding the scope. The village sprang to life below her. It was a beehive of activity. Fighters were streaming out of buildings, forming up into assault groups. And there, in the same courtyard, surrounded by even more guards, was Ghani Bardar. He was standing on a makeshift platform, gesturing toward the mountain, rallying his men for the final push. He was exposed. He was confident. He was a dead man walking. Gracie ranged the target, 620 meters, a slight crosswind from left to right, maybe 3 knots. She adjusted her elevation, her windage. She exhaled halfway, her finger resting gently on the trigger. And the world narrowed to a single point, the space between Bardar's eyes. In her earpiece, she could hear Wedge's voice, strained but steady, calling out the enemy's movements. "They're forming up, Crow. They're coming. We're almost out of time." Gracie didn't answer. She was beyond words. She was a machine of focused intent. She thought of the 2 wounded SEALs, of Ox's bloody arm, of the sneers and the doubts and the long, hard road that had led her to this exact moment. And then she let the air slip from her lungs. The crack of the rifle was a thunderclap in the thin mountain air. The bullet, traveling faster than the speed of sound, crossed the distance in less than a second. Through her scope, Gracie saw it happen. Bardar's head snapped back, a fine pink mist erupting behind him. His body crumpled. falling from the platform like a sack of potatoes. For a heartbeat, the entire village square froze. The fighters, who had been moments from launching their assault, stood dumbfounded, staring at the lifeless body of their leader. Then, chaos. The meticulously planned attack dissolved into pandemonium. Men ran in every direction, some dropping their weapons, others firing wildly into the air. The iron grip of command was shattered. On the mountain, Wedge watched through his binoculars as the enemy force below them disintegrated. He couldn't believe it. She had done it. Against all odds, she had done it. He keyed his mic, his voice thick with emotion. "Saber elements, this is Saber Actual. The target is down. I repeat, the target is down. Enemy forces are disorganized and breaking contact. All units, hold your positions. Ah, we have friendlies inbound." He looked up toward Raven's Roost, where a small figure was now waving an arm, signaling her success. "Command," he radioed. "This is Saber Actual. Mission accomplished. Request immediate Cassivac for 2 wounded. And tell them we have a guardian angel up here who needs a ride home." The extraction was a blur of activity. Blackhawks swooped in, their door gunners laying down, suppressing fire on the remnants of the insurgent force, who were too busy running for their lives to offer any real resistance. The wounded were loaded first, their cries of pain a stark reminder of the cost of victory. Gracie was pulled onto a helicopter by Ox, who wrapped a massive arm around her and pulled her close against the roar of the rotors. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. But as the helicopter lifted off and the mountain shrank beneath them, Gracie allowed herself a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. She closed her eyes, the image of Bardhar falling frozen in her mind. The mission was over. She had made the shot. Back at the forward operating base, the debriefing was a subdued affair. Wedge sat across from a senior intelligence officer, walking him through the operation step by step. When he got to the part about the ambush and Gracie's decision to abandon her post to help the team, the officer frowned. "That's a serious breach of protocol, Commander. She risked the entire mission." Before Wedge could respond, the door to the briefing room burst open. A gunnery sergeant stood there, his face flushed. "Sir, you need to come outside. Now." They stepped out of the tent into the harsh afternoon sun, and the entire base seemed to have turned out. A formation of soldiers, Marines, and airmen stood at attention. In the center of them all was Gracie Medicine Crow, looking bewildered and slightly embarrassed. As Wedge watched, the base commander, a full colonel, stepped forward and pinned something to her uniform. Even from a distance, Wedge could see the glint of bronze. It was the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest awards for valor in combat. The citation was being read over the loudspeaker. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. While under intense enemy fire, she single-handedly disrupted a coordinated enemy assault, saving the lives of multiple U.S. service members, and then, despite grievous personal risk, returned to her position to successfully engage and eliminate a high-value target." Ox, by his arm in a sling, was in the crowd, cheering louder than anyone. Wedge stood at the back, a quiet smile on his face. He thought back to the briefing room, to the resentment, the doubt, the fear that this woman would be a liability. He had been so wrong. They had deployed a whole army, a force of elite operators, and they had been on the brink of annihilation. Then a female sniper, the one they hadn't wanted, the one they had doubted, had ended it with a single shot. But it wasn't just the shot. It was her courage, her sacrifice, her refusal to abandon them when they needed her most. As the applause died down and Gracie was mobbed by well-wishers, Wedge caught her eye. He gave her a slow, deliberate salute. She returned it, a small, tired smile on her face. The legend of Gracie Medicine Crow was just beginning. But for those who had been on that mountain, it would never be forgotten.